To get started, obviously a hot topic is tariffs. And what levers do companies have to pull to negotiate these tariffs in the environment that we're in right now? And one of those levers, if not the only lever left, is the foreign trade zones program. And so that's what Craig and I are going to discuss today: is what is the foreign trade zones program, what are the benefits, and how can I get involved, and what does that look like for my company?
Yeah, so we're going to go ahead and jump into the PowerPoint. Right now, we're going to start off with the FTZ program because that, Chattanooga has a good program. It's really the only, like Maddi said, the only tool out there to mitigate those tariffs today. Other tools have really been blocked by the administration.
Yeah. So what is the foreign trade zone program? It's an area, a designated area in or adjacent to a customs port of entry, and it's considered to be outside of customs territory. I always like to give the caveat: it is outside of customs territory only for tariff purposes, for no other reasons. You can do nothing illegal in an FTZ. So get any ideas? But yeah, so why was it founded? And it was really founded to help compete in the foreign market, and to help minimize, eliminate duties, taxes, and your fees on imports. Anything to add to that, Craig?
No, so it's the Foreign Trade Zones Act, and we'll hit that in the next slide. Foreign Trade Zones Act of 1934. Ironically, it was founded to help offset the damages done by the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, where tariffs were raised on imports, and the economy was starting to tank, and there was an effort to, what can we do? And that's really how the Foreign Trade Zones Act came into play.
Yeah, exactly. And going into that, as by Congress through the Foreign Trade Zones Act of 1934. Again, it was designed to stimulate international trade as well as create and retain jobs, capital investments in the U.S. I feel like all of you today can agree with that sentiment, and that's really the core of the program. All right, so getting into the oversight. So with any government program, I'm sure you're all familiar, there's some sort of oversight. And so for the U.S. Foreign Trade Zones Board, that's comprised of the Secretary of Treasury and the Secretary of Commerce, and the FTZ board staff that helps with the applications and the designations of the FTZ. They reside in the Department of Commerce. So the FTZ grantee, so on a local level, what does that oversight look like? So Steve Hyatt here is a great resource for you with the Chattanooga Chamber Foundation in terms of getting your actual facility designated as an FTZ. And the counties that covered for this rapid establishment, it's about a 30-day application process, are Hamilton, Grundy, Marion, Warren, Sequatchie, Bledsoe, Ray, Meigs, Bradley, Polk, and McMinn. And then the day-to-day oversight, so the FTZ grantee, they help with the establishment of the zone through the board in DC. But in terms of day-to-day oversight, your local Customs and Border Protection will provide that.
And just a note, if you run into a manufacturing or distribution operation outside these counties, that doesn't mean we can't help them. It means they'll be outside the 30-day period. It'll be a 90-day period to establish a subzone. The only caveat being, you would want to pick a halfway point between here and Nashville, and not for lack of a better word, poach on their grantee, and same going to Knoxville. But I just didn't want you to think those counties limit you. You're outside the counties, you're out of luck, because that's not the case. We can always and keep in mind, when we say this, we're bringing the foreign trade zone to you. So we're not saying you have to relocate into a zone or anything like that. We bring it to your facility.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. So there's I know a lot of folks, when we, kind of bring up foreign trade zones, it's like, do we need to move our, whole facility to a piece of land? No, it'll be your actual facility that would be designated as an FTZ. All right, so we're going to jump in. How do you establish an FTZ? I kind of hit on this already, but again, there's that application process with the Foreign Trade Zones Board to receive designation. You'd work with the Chattanooga Chamber and Steve Hyatt's team to get that application submitted. Again, like we mentioned, for that rapid, in those counties, that rapid implementation, it's about 30 days. But again, if you're outside of those counties, it'd be about 90 for the application portion. And then there's an activation with Customs and Border Protection. So they're mainly looking out to make sure that the goods are secure. And what does your security at your facility look like, and are you following the rules? That process can take, I don't know, what would you say, Craig, about a month or so, maybe 2?
Activation, yeah.
And then you'll have implementation of your compliant FTZ software. So now that you're playing by some new rules, it is required actually to get called an inventory control and record keeping system, or an ICRS system. That's just to make sure that you're playing by the rules with your inventory, and is all accounted for. All right, so let's get into the benefits. So we've gone over what is an FTZ, how do we get one, but the real reason we're all here is how can we save money. So let's get into those. All right, so I'd like to always start with a baseline, so that we're all familiar and we're all talking the same language before I start adding in some new concepts. So traditional importing in a non-FTZ facility, your imported container comes, as it hits U.S. soil, duties are paid, and then it moves to your warehouse. So again, duties are paid as the merchandise hits the U.S. So now what are the FTZ benefits? So these are the ones that we're going to cover today. For duty, so duty is no longer paid as it hits U.S. soil, but instead it's paid as it hits U.S. commerce, and we'll dive into a little bit of that and explain that a little bit further. Relief from inverted tariff. This is one that we hope is soon restored. There are some caveats around it with those IEEPA tariffs, but really what the heart of inverted tariff is you pay the duty on the finished good rather than the component.
Yeah, and I'd like to touch on this one for a minute, because this is really what brought the foreign trade zone into play and encouraged its growth. And started with the big three and expanded to other manufacturing. And what this does is the Foreign Trade Zones Act says that you can, generally speaking, you can choose the component rate or the finished goods on where you pay duty. So why is that important? So let's take forklifts. That's always a good example. You bring a forklift into the United States, you import it from Japan, China, wherever. Generally speaking, let's say before these tariffs, you import that at zero, forklift rate is 0. But you're manufacturing your Nissan forklift, manufacturing forklifts in the U.S., you're paying millions of dollars on components. Even though you have 100% U.S. labor, 70% U.S. capital and investment, and about 50% U.S. components, you're paying a huge penalty. Yet what the FTZ program allowed you to do is say, we're not going to pay duty on the components, we're going to bring that in, and we're going to pay duty on the forklift when it leaves, on the foreign content, those components, but at the forklift rate of free. Unfortunately, this is my opinion, I shouldn't allow color, but I'm going to do it. DC doesn't really understand how manufacturing is done sometimes, so those tariffs are locked in. So this really doesn't apply anymore, because all the tariffs that come in are locked in when they come in the door. So manufacturers are stuck paying those regardless of how, so the ability to level the playing field has gone away. That doesn't mean there's not huge benefits to mitigate the tariff costs, but just keep in mind, because our hope is that that benefit will slowly come back and we'll see opportunities come again.
Great. And then our next benefit would be that we're going to hit on is the duty elimination or reduction for any scrap or waste. So in an FTZ, you don't have to pay duties on any scrap or waste.
If I can touch on that one too, when I started off many years ago, about 35 years ago actually, working with Chattanooga and other places, I had this perceived notion that it's got to be a big company to benefit from the zone. And I had one small company with, at that time, 11 employees. And I almost didn't visit because I'm like, 11 employees, doesn't make sense for them. How can they save money? Because it's a fairly decent cost of entry. But it turns out their production process, they lost 30% due to evaporation. They actually had a molecular deal, and this is way over my head, where you have a kilo of product A, kilo of product B, and it only comes to 1.5 because of what the molecules do. All of that led to 30%, and they don't pay duty on that 30%. So that still exists today. So if you have operations that have yield loss, stamping, things like that, it's a pretty big benefit. So Steve probably knows the company I'm talking about there.
Going into the next one, generally no duty is paid on any re-exported merchandise. So if you bring in foreign merchandise and then export it to South America, you avoid duties altogether. And then we're going to jump into weekly entry filing. That's really a cornerstone of the FTZ program in a way that a lot of folks save on import fees that they may not even be aware of. All right, so jumping into the duty deferral benefit. So in that slide before, as we discussed, as duties paid as it hits U.S. soil, then it moves to the warehouse. So in an FTZ environment, that duty, how that duty is paid is going to change. In an FTZ environment, the container is going to hit U.S. soil. It is going to move straight to your facility. It is going to live in your facility for however long you would like, and then you pay duty as it leaves your warehouse. It enters into U.S. commerce. The duty deferral benefit is really that time value of money of what else could you be doing with that money instead of it being tied up in tariffs at that time. I'm a finance major, so time value of money is really important to me. So especially folks who don't turn their inventory very often, this can be a significant savings. So again, back to the visual we had. Again, the container hits directly to your facility. It'll live in your facility. We have warehouse here, but your manufacturing facility, whatever it is, it'll live there, and then the duties are paid as it leaves your facility and enters into U.S. commerce. All right, so relief from inverted tariff. So Craig mentioned this just a minute ago, with that forklift example. But again, just to reiterate, you have the choice in an FTZ. You did have the choice in an FTZ to either pay at the component level or the finished good level. And just another example that I've seen this work really well is in pharma companies, those who manufacture pharmaceuticals. I've seen the API come in at the active pharmaceutical ingredient come in at 7%, but the actual finished good, in this case it was actually a flea and tick medication I give to my pet, was 0%. And so they were able in 1 year to save $1.5 million just by leveraging the program.
And I'll touch on farmers since you brought that up. There's other benefits they have too. Naturally, they're doing production and not discrete manufacturing, so they also have that yield loss. But most pharma companies today are getting in the zones program regardless of the FTZ tariff savings, regardless of duty deferral, yield loss, all that. Because they're outside the commerce of the U.S., they can bring in a product that, say, Paxlovid. Paxlovid wasn't approved yet, but they knew when it was approved it was going to save a lot of lives. They had to get it ready to ship. So they can go ahead and bring it into a foreign trade zone because it's outside the commerce of the United States, package it, get it ready to go, where the minute the FDA approves it, they can start shipping. And more of the large pharma companies are dictating to the smaller ones that provide to them, you have to be a foreign trade zone just for this one benefit. The other benefits stack on top of that, but the ability to go ahead and manufacture a product, get it ready to ship when they're fully confident they'll get FDA approval is huge.
Absolutely, great point. But again, just want to make that note, these punitive tariffs have made this really difficult and really minimized this benefit for folks. But this is something Craig and I are both part of the NAFTZ, National Association for Foreign Trade Zones, that does a lot of lobbying to get this restored. So it's something that's being actively worked on, and we hope it's restored. But again, just a visual, you bring in your motor from Taiwan at 4%, you manufacture it in your facility. Again, back to that framework, you're now paying as it leaves the FTZ, so you paid at that lower duty rate of the vacuum at 0%. I'm going to take a quick pause. I feel like we've given a lot of information. Do you guys have any questions? Is this resonating, tracking at all? Okay. Please feel free. We love questions, so if you have them as you rise, I probably should have led with this. Please raise your hand. We're happy to answer those, and we've absolutely saved time at the end as well. All right, so duty elimination on scrap, waste, yield loss. Craig's kind of mentioned this already, but you completely eliminate duty on any scrap. So for an example, Craig, do you want to hit on your example about the packing and the stamping?
Yeah, there's a lot of different processes that have significant scrap. The example I use, because this is actually really prevalent, there's a lot of manufacturing operations in the U.S. that are importing sheets of aluminum, which, as we all know, have some pretty high tariffs. But the most common is a lot of what they stamp are circular lids to anywhere from sour cream. Anybody that's opened to yogurt has opened that aluminum top. Well, you have it square sheets, you're stamping circles, you can imagine the amount of waste you have. So rather today, if they're not a zone, they're bringing that in, they're paying duty on everything. Now that they are a zone, all that waste, they can avoid paying the duty on that. So it's a pretty huge savings.
Yeah, and then again, in terms of that chemical production, again, what Craig mentioned before, if you lose 10% through your manufacturing process as scrap or waste, no duty is paid. Duty avoidance on exports. This is kind of a hidden one that not many folks know about. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the duty drawback program. It's where you pay obviously the tariffs, but then you export and then you go back to the government, and it's this long, arduous process of trying to get your 99% back in tariffs. In the FTZ program, that money never leaves your hand. So when you export, you don't pay duties at all in an FTZ because again, it never entered into U.S. commerce. And as we, kind of the framework here is you pay duties as it enters U.S. commerce, not necessarily when it hits U.S. soil.
Yeah, and drawback's a good program, but even those companies, well, some of the new tariffs don't allow for drawback. The administration specifically wrote that in there. We're not going to allow for drawback, which I'll be honest with you, I don't get because we're supposed to be promoting exports, but I'll try not to go too far down that rabbit hole. But one of the problems with drawback is companies have this idea that the rule says we get 99% back of what we pay, but keep in mind, you have to get your vendors to give you the amount of duty they paid and the duty rate. Well, it doesn't take a genius to use some simple algebra to take that, what they paid and the duty rate to figure out their landed cost. So what they end up is this expectation they're going to get all their exports, duty paid on exports back, but in general they average about 50% because only 50% of the vendors are willing to give them that data. Especially in the automotive industry, they really seriously don't want to give them the landed cost.
Again, so back to the graphic, you'll import, to your facility, the motor, and then in this situation, this was before it was exported to Canada, no duties paid. Really, we should have some sort of like European country or South American country up there, but no duties paid. Merchandise processing fee reduction. So Craig explains this one really well on a daily basis. Craig, do you want to dive into the merchandise processing fee reduction?
Yeah, so every time you import into the United States, you pay a merchandise processing fee. And this is a fee that Customs charges. Doesn't matter whether you have a duty rate of free or duty rate of 24%, you're going to pay this duty as 0.3464% times the value of the merchandise. And that may be my typo. That should be 0.3464% times the value of the merchandise. But it's got a cap of $634, roughly $635. So to give you an example, with a company that imports 1,000 customs entries today, they're going to pay roughly $634,000 just in merchandise processing fee. And a lot of companies don't really look at this because they look at the overall import costs, and this is just tagged on to what's called the Customs Form 7501, where they pay duty. So they kind of ignore this, but there's ability to reduce this quite a bit. So the Foreign Trade Zones program is the only program that allows a program called weekly entry. And weekly entry allows you to make entry only once a week for everything that ships out of the zone. So there's a couple of caveats there. You tell Customs what you're going to ship, and then you ship it, and then at the end of the week, you say, this is what I shipped, this is how much money I owe you. So in this case, you're looking at taking that $634,000, or $634,000, $1,000 down to roughly $33,000. So a huge savings of $600,000. So it's pretty easy to extrapolate. Even a company that does 100 customs entries is going to save on this. I mentioned Nissan forklift earlier. I don't think they'll mind me telling you that even though they pay millions of dollars in tariffs on their components, they were shocked to find out that they saved even more money on the merchandise processing fee. So this just isn't limited to distribution. Manufacturers, keep in mind, think about the automotive manufacturer here, how many imports they have, whether their vendors do it or they do it, it's a ton. So if they can reduce that to that weekly entry, what they do take advantage of, that's a huge savings.
Yeah, so to the visual, just to kind of, I know it can get a little confusing, especially with new concepts. But let's just say, for example, you bring in 1 container a day, Monday through Friday, right? So you pay that merchandise processing fee, let's say you're maxing it out, you're paying $634 5 times in 1 week. That totals, $3,173.10. So then we extrapolated that out to a year, $165,000. Again, this would just be for 5 containers in a week. Now in an FTZ, again, back to that framework, you're not paying until it enters U.S. commerce, and if you're only going to make weekly entries, so it's 1 entry a week. So you bring in those 5 containers, nothing is paid, goes to your facility, and then let's say you ship out the same amount, so 5 shipments in that week as well. You'll pay just that $634 once because you made weekly entry. Does that make sense? Is that clear?
Is anybody from Customs here? Okay, figured I'd ask. So there's another benefit that normally, I don't know whether you guys have heard of intensive inspections. That's when merchandise comes in, they hold your merchandise to do an intensive inspection. Well, there's rule-based intensive inspections and there's statistical. So some of those are unavoidable. Stats come up and it says, this hasn't been examined, this country hasn't been examined, this product, we're going to examine it. Other times they put in rules, these are toys. Customs doesn't like toys at all from an import standpoint, so they're more likely to get inspected. The trigger for that is the Customs Form 3461 and 7501. In an FTZ, that happens after it's shipped out the door. So one advantage is you tend to see your inspections go down quite a bit because that trigger has moved from as it comes in to as it goes out. Customs still has control of that merchandise. If there's a problem, they can still tag the container, the carrier, the freight forwarder, things like that, and they monitor that. But it's a benefit that, I talk about that benefit after I ask that question I just asked.
So then to zone transfers, okay, so as your wheels start turning, it's, okay, what if I have 2 DCs, one's on the West Coast, one's on the East Coast, and I need to move it from, one facility to the other. If both are designated as an FTZ, so let's say your goods come in on that West Coast facility and you want to move them to your DC on the East Coast, let's say you're in Chattanooga, you can move those from zone to zone without realizing any duties. Because again, it's not hitting U.S. commerce, it's just moving from one FTZ to another, and both of those are considered outside of customs of territory and outside of U.S. commerce. Anything to add on that one, Fred?
Yeah, you've got some industries, both distribution and manufacturing, but let's take a distribution, Ralph Lauren. Ralph Lauren has taken the approach that they don't always know, no matter how much they try, and they try to create markets, but they don't always know where the market for goods will be. So their idea is they no longer want to pay duty. They want to be able to transfer it from East Coast to West Coast without paying duty, that zone-to-zone transfer. But at the same time, if the market is better in California, they want to do that without having paid duty in the U.S. to make sure that their profit margin isn't hurt. And I think we're going to see more and more companies take advantage of that, and this zone-to-zone transfer between zones allows them to do that. They're able to move it where the product is needed, where the demand is inside the U.S. without ever paying any customs duties.
All right, so we're going to jump into some common questions that we typically see, and then we'll open it up to the floor for any. Are there any changes to my operations is the main question that we typically see, which is fair and valid, especially when you're bringing in, customs and the Foreign Trade Zones Board. What does that look like for your facility on a day-to-day basis? So the program was designed so that you can conduct business as usual. Again, back to what it was founded on is to stimulate growth and capital investments in the U.S. So really, it's to I like to say change the rules a little bit, but not necessarily your game board. So your facility is still the same, the people are still the same, the game board's the same. It's just the rules of the game are changing a little bit. Anything to add to that, Craig?
Yeah, I always tell companies that if they implement a zone and the way they run their operations is different after they implemented the zone, they've either done that by choice because they've used the zone as a hammer to get things in place that they wanted anyway, or they've done something wrong because you could zones that we worked with on implementation, we set up, you could look at them a year before they're zoned, a year after, and there's no difference in the operations. It all comes down to the software and an FTZ administrator handling everything.
All right, so let's say Craig and I did a good job in this presentation and you're interested in becoming a zone. What does that look like? So the first thing we recommend is conducting a feasibility study to predict your savings. Craig and I offer those at no charge, but definitely the numbers don't lie. So I think that's always the first step is conducting that feasibility study to really see what your savings in your facility would be. And then after that, if the savings are good, definitely contact Steve and his team over at the chamber. You can contact us and your import compliance or consultant to help kind of with that process of becoming a zone.
Yeah, and it's interesting to me how those analyses have progressed too. It used to be, my threshold was always $100,000. If you didn't save a minimum of $100,000 in the first year, then don't go forward. Now, if you think about that, those of you that ever buy production equipment or are involved in that, if you could get all your money back on an investment in production equipment in 1 year, you would write the check that day. But zones are intangible, so companies are a little more cautious, and I understand that, and that's why we have the $100,000. But more and more I get back from companies today. One company put it best. I had an analysis, and I said, look, you don't quite break even the first year. You do in 2, 3, and 4, but I would recommend you not go forward. And they told me they didn't care. They no longer want to pay customs duties until they can invoice a customer to cover those customs duties, because those tariff rates are so high that they no longer want to carry that cost.
Hey, well, thank you guys so much for having us. We really appreciate, all of you coming out. I know it's early in the morning. We really appreciate it, and we've enjoyed this. Thank you again.